Thank you so much, James, for joining us and doing this presentation. I have heard a lot about it, and so but I have not had a chance to experience it. So I am really looking forward to this. And again, just thank you so much for taking your time and helping us out with that. And again, without any further ado, I'm just going to let you take the stage.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, so I'll just start by acknowledging I am speaking to you from Gatineau. I grew up in southern Quebec, work in Ottawa, but live on the Quebec side of the river still. And I'd like to acknowledge with immense gratitude that the land from which I'm presenting, both in Ottawa and Gatineau, is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. So I think as the bio showed at the beginning, I've got a few things that I work on, species at risk being one of them, but also I've been the lead in the creation and bringing of iNaturalist to Canada, and I'll talk all about that. This kind of overview of what I'm going through. And at the end of each of these sections, I'll pause for a bit of a discussion. So I'm going to try and keep it a bit interactive. So I'll have a bit of time for discussion at the end of each of these. And I would like to preface this as well that iNaturalist in and of itself is not community science. It's a tool to undertake community science, along with many other tools. I really liked Stephen's point as he was talking about the engagement with the community, where they can send a photo to an actual person and you can have that interaction. iNaturalist can facilitate that, but people just adding a whole bunch of stuff is valuable, as James was talking this morning, to data collection, but in and of itself, there's not that same interaction that you can get from actually talking to a biologist or the community members or Indigenous knowledge holders. iNaturalist does have a way of communicating through comments and interacting with people on the platform, but it still isn't quite the same as in-person, one-on-one type engagement. Yeah, just quickly, CWF does lead iNaturalist in Canada, along with our partners at NatureServe Canada and Parks Canada. And thanks, Hannah, because I hadn't realized NatureServe Canada changed their logo, and I quickly switched that before I had this presentation. They didn't tell me that. I'm gonna have to update on that. So I'm talking about iNaturalist Canada because we are one of about 19 countries. There's a few more in the works that have their own version of iNaturalist around the world. They each have their own language, translation of their own language. So we have French and English in Canada. That's kind of how the database looks globally. We have over almost 10 million observations in Canada, 130 million around the world. So it's a huge database. And each of our countries' databases feed into the global iNaturalist.org database. There is a benefit to using iNaturalist Canada as opposed to just going through .org. For one, a large one is for one, it's bilingual, French and English, but also we can access and share that data much more easily, which I'm going to get into. Kind of real quick, here's the growth over time. It's kind of exponential. Last point says today, but that's actually last November, I think. So you see it's not quite over 9 million. We're actually 9.8 right now. Those are number of species, observations, people contributing, both contributing observations, but identifications as well. And with that success comes a bit of a challenge. With that many observations being submitted, it's outpacing the ability for people to identify everything there. So that orange line are what's called research grade observations, which means at least one other person has agreed with the identification of the original observer, and it kind of works on a 2/3 majority. So it can fluctuate. So if someone agrees and somebody else disagrees, it can bump that back away from what's called research grade. But just to show that we're kind of outpacing our ability. Roughly 64 or 63% of observations in all of iNaturalist in Canada are what's called research grade. I had used this slide for the Canadian and reptile amphibian workshop, and shockingly, when I was working for this, it's like 96% of all observations of herps have been identified to research grade. which was amazing to me in and of itself. And so I was like, oh, well, what does it look like for Massasauga? So I checked that. I don't have the graph, but it wouldn't be hard because it would be entirely green. Like 100% of all observations of Massasauga that are verifiable, so they have a photo and enough details to verify them, are identified to research grade, which is amazing. So whoever, all your group of folks are doing an amazing job. So it's one to say that there's a great group of people identifying, but it also means to me that people are taking good photos of them as well, meaning that photo is actually identifiable. It's not a snake off in the distance that someone can't really tell what it is. It means every one of those pictures has a good, accurate location, has a photo that's identifiable. So that's also valuable to hear about. Real quick, so the value of community science observations. I mean, I think it's kind of preaching to the choir here, but I'm going to mention a couple of things. So one, can pinpoint areas of threat, like road mortality hotspots for not just snakes, but other species on the road. We're using that to pinpoint data for boat strikes for northern map turtles. So we're using that locational information. I'd use this slide as well for that last presentation. We can locate new basking sites and interesting thermal regulation behaviors, new ways of dispersal, and methods to get around. But also, this is an observation from 2019 of Pacific oversnake. The species hadn't been seen in Canada since 1957. And those two comments at the bottom are comments that were made on this actual observation from community experts on iNaturalist. So yeah, something that had not been confirmed in 50 years. And there's numerous occurrences like this in iNaturalist that have been found. Either the observer knew that's what it was and took a photo, or maybe didn't even know and found out after the fact. Also for species at risk, obviously the Massasauga as well included. As Hannah mentioned, CSIWIC assesses the status of species in Canada, and they are more and more relying on the community science data, including iNaturalist, but also eBird. There are 3 species in recent assessments that were very heavily weighted by community science. A bumblebee species, so they used iNaturalist and Bumblebee Watch, which really confirmed the fact that the American bumblebee was not observed in the data was basically, but all these other common bumblebees allows them to kind of assess the search effort, right? The fact that it wasn't seen. So lack of data was actually valuable in this case. But then also it can help inform critical habitat. So this is a snapshot of once a species is listed, assessed by CSIWIC, listed by the government, a recovery strategy has to be developed that then identifies a critical habitat. This is the mapping of critical habitat under the Federal Species at Risk Act for Massasauga. And on the right-hand side, we see the iNaturalist observations as well. Matching up pretty well. I'm not drilling down into the specifics, but it could really be looked at once we can get the true location, and I'll talk about data obscuring and hidden observations. But we could match this up with what the critical habitat actually is, and if there are any new points outside of that. So I'm really oversimplifying, but in general, the critical habitat was defined using sites where the species has been observed and buffered by 1.2 kilometer radius. There's more nuance to it than that, but in a nutshell, that's what it is. So if there are other occurrences outside of what's previously known as critical habitat, then that can help inform that. Also to note, the recovery strategy was developed, it was drafted in 2013. So this is 10 years old. Based on NHIC data predominantly, so the conservation data centers, which are affiliated with NatureServe Canada, which was great information, still is the best source of information you can have on species at risk. But at the time, they wouldn't have incorporated any of the iNaturalist data into their databases. Now, the conservation data centers all do incorporate or have access to the iNaturalist occurrence data as well. So I'm going to shift into kind of the specifics, or not all the specifics, but some of the nuances of adding observations. So I'm not going to get into all the details of how to take a picture and upload it to the website or the app. We do have I have a full hour webinar just on how to do that if anybody's interested. It's on the iNaturalist website under the resources section. But there are a couple of nuances that I wanted to point out. So the basics, we can drag in, this is on the website, you can drag and drop photos, they can become on observation. Once you fill in your information, you can click submit. But then, what I wanted to touch on is what makes a good observation. And so I am going to exit this and actually show the website itself. And this observation here, for anybody that might want to, I can't copy from my notes. Let me get out of this and head here. So this is that observation itself. I'm going to drop this into the chat that anybody who wants to follow along and have a look at this, because I'm going to ask as I'm talking, if anybody has any comments on the quality of this observation. Not to pick on this person, I actually don't know who this is, and I hope it's not anybody on this meeting. Actually, it is a good observation. So there's a few nuances that I want to talk about or show what an observation, and if anybody has some thoughts as to how it could be improved, drop it in the chat. This is kind of a interaction while I go, and you can not pay attention to me if you want. You can just look through the observation. So first and foremost, got a good photo, close up, couple of photos to show different angles. It's got a location and a date. So that checks off a bunch of the key parts to begin with. We see it's research grade, so at least one other person has agreed with the identification. A good place to look at to kind of a bit of a checklist for observations. If you scroll down to the data quality assessment, this is kind of it works as a checklist kind of thing for your observations. So as I mentioned, the date, location, has photos. It's research grade, so it is supported by 2 or more. Those first ones are automatically generated by the site. We can't change them, but what we can look at as well are these kind of voting options here. There are definitely cases where someone takes a photo of something, it's obviously in the winter and the date is a summer date. So we can look at that as to whether the data is accurate. Location, which I'm going to talk about a bit in a second. Wild, is it something from a zoo or is it someone's pet? And then the evidence, sometimes people say they have a photo, but there's no actual evidence that that species is in the photo. So all of these, once they get clicked as a voted down by anybody who's logged into iNaturalist can see this, that will pull this research graded quality off the observation. And I just realized this is half in the screen. We'll pull that off the research grade observation and we'll bump it down to what's called casual, which means something needs to fix that is to make that observation back up, bring it back up to research grade. So I see a couple comments already in the chat as to what could make this better. Definitely a description. Something that could be obvious is just, a note on, where it was found, what the habitat was like. I chose this observation as well because this is, to me, is obviously on a road. So something that can also, and yes, more identifications, other people could agree with that. I can actually come in and do that in here. I could actually just click and agree with the observation. Something I wanted to touch on as well, why I chose this photo, is the annotations. So this can be done at the time of adding the observation itself, but you can go back to it and check, and we can click some of these and they're species group specific. So because it's an animal, it gives alive or dead and life stage. If it's a plant, it gives different options here. But these are valuable because we can say, yes, it's alive. There's a photo, there's the life stage. We can say that it's an adult or juvenile. The other thing we can do with this is add an observation field, which are specific fields that give extra information about that species. So we can start typing one of these observation fields when we know about one. I'm going to talk about them a bit later, so bear with me if you don't quite understand what those are yet. But we can give it a value, and in this one I'm going to mention that it's on a road because I know this observation field exists. And then we can choose a drop-down list because the person who created these are custom made. We can note that it's alive on the road. Now to come back to the, don't know what that did. The mention of the data quality. One thing is we see the there is a location, but if we look at the details of the location, the accuracy is almost 500 meters, which isn't terrible for a species that moves, but if it's a plant especially, that could be considerably improved upon. Also, when you look at the snake, could be on this row where this point is, but it could also be on this cross street. So anywhere within this buffer could be the actual location that that person recorded it. My suspicion is that they kind of just zoomed on the map and clicked a point. They think they knew, person thought they knew where they, or figured they knew where they were, but they didn't kind of think about what the implications of that are. If we go to the image itself, we click on the information about it, it will actually bring up how that observation was taken. And we see this was made by Nikon, the model of the camera. So this is, my assumption was originally that it was probably taken with a digital camera as opposed to a smartphone with a GPS enabled device to be able to get that location. And that's kind of what it was. So I'm thinking when they uploaded it to the website, they didn't really kind of zoom in enough to really pinpoint where that observation was. So I'm going to pull back to my presentation. Get in there. Okay, so the point here was that an accuracy is really also very important. So this one had an accuracy, but there are 1.8 million observations in Canada that have no accuracy at all. So basically, this data is kind of unusable. And the species with the most that doesn't have an accuracy is the monarch, which is also a species at risk in Canada. But up there we have snapping turtles. There are 500 observations of blandings turtles and 220 of Massasauga that don't have an accuracy recorded whatsoever. And the reason behind most of this is because when people upload to the website, even if it was taken with a GPS location, GPS enabled smartphone or camera, some digital cameras have GPS ability. We're looking at this snapping turtle observation that has a location, which we can see here, but the accuracy is not automatically pulled in from your GPS device, regardless of whether it's smartphone or digital camera. So what we need to do is when we upload online is to click on this location. It brings up a map, and you see here, there's nothing written in here as an accuracy. So even just clicking a point on the map will give it a boundary based on the kind of the scale of the map. You can zoom in and out or grab these little white dots and make it larger or smaller to really hone in on exactly where you were. And now you see I've got an accuracy of 40 meters, roughly where that observation was taken. Click update and oops, and it adds it to the observation itself. So this is kind of a key thing to think about when adding observations. Now coming back to the that checklist that I was mentioning, I was showing on the observation page. Something we can consider, I haven't done this yet because I feel like it might be a little bit cutthroat, is we could go through and look at the location for all, so there's okay, I'll finish that sentence first and then I'll come back to something. We could vote this down because if there's no accuracy or if it's really poor, we could vote that down and it pushes the observation back to casual, and then that might flag to the observer to be like, oh, I need to fix something. I'm not sure how observers would take that, so I haven't done that yet. But it's just something good to keep bear in mind when we're adding observations. Now there is a custom URL, so there's custom search terms we can use within iNaturalist, and I'm going to get into those a little bit later. But there's basically a way to search for observations, and you can search for all observations that do not have any accuracy as attributed to them. So that's how I could find out there were 220 Massasauga observations without an accuracy, and I'll get into how we can use those custom search searches afterwards. So also when you're adding observations, if you're to make it a little quicker, if you select all or control click all these, you can use the fields on the left to give all those observations the same value. So you could give them all the same accuracy of 100 meters or something, just to have an accuracy in there, and then I'll update all of them at once. This is also where you see fields. here. And these are, as I mentioned, fields that people can create in iNaturalist, and you can add a field to your observation, like on roads. If you click on, there we go. If you click on view field options, it'll take you to a new page that you can search for different fields. And in this one, I was curious about the on roads possibility. So in here, I search roads. I'm just looking at this one, the field is called on road. And then you can see the values on the right-hand side that you can give it a value, and you can search through observations, all observations that have used this field and have this value of like alive or dead on road if you're interested in road mortality. You can also then, at the bottom, you can click through to actually see the map and observations that have these values entered into this field. There's also, as I mentioned, the custom URL, which in the top here, place ID, basically this number is all Canada. These are all observations, and I'm looking for the field that are on road. So these are all the observations in Canada that have this field used in iNaturalist. I'm going to talk a little bit more about these custom URLs at the end, and I've got a link to a whole bunch more information on how to use these. Similar to using the app, again, notice there's an accuracy noted there. So important to kind of wait until that accuracy hones in a little bit. It starts really large and then it kind of pinpoints you a little more accurately. Also, if you're using, so this is if you take the photo through the app, if you have a photo on your smartphone, it will do the same as the website. It will, if you choose to add existing photo instead of taking a photo, it will bring in the GPS coordinate, but it won't pull the accuracy in the same way it doesn't on the website. So again, you'll have to click on that and give it an accuracy. Yeah, and then something else to mention on the using the app. Most people noticed, if you're using the image recognition software, a bunch of species show up in the list. That's great for common species and things that are seen nearby. I've been getting the question from people who are like, well, I know what this is, it's not showing up on the list. I would suggest also, for one, if you use multiple photos, you can switch which photo. If you have two photos here, you can switch which one comes first, and that'll change the image recognition software to look at that first photo because no one looks at the first one. So you could use the couple of photos to see if you can get a better ID. But also if you click the include suggestions not seen nearby, that'll show species that haven't already been observed in your area. So if you're wondering why your species isn't showing up, it might just be because it hasn't yet been seen around there. So that'll give you a few more options. For right now, you do need a data connection to access the image recognition software offline, or to access the image recognition software. There's going to be a new iteration of the app. I don't know when that's coming, late summer at the earliest, I would say, that will eventually incorporate the image recognition software offline. So you won't need to be connected to the internet to be able to use that, which is going to be a really huge advantage, I think. Oh, there we go. Circle that. So I was going to pause there for a bit of a discussion. I just threw up this map of the, again, the observations of iNaturalist of Massasauga in iNaturalist in Canada. And iNaturalist, the About page uses range maps as well. These are largely based off of IUCN, so it superimposes the range map. But curators also have the ability to edit and refine these. So there's a Google Doc explaining how range maps are designed, derived in iNaturalist, and how people, if they're interested, can curate those. And I can drop that into the chat as well for anybody who's interested in helping to curate range maps. So with that, we can, if anybody has questions for maybe a couple of minutes, we can talk about that. Bearing in mind when I'm going to talk about obscuring. So if anyone's like, well, why can you not see this right now and we're not zoomed in enough, I'm going to talk about why data is hidden or not in iNaturalist.
Yeah, thank you so much, James. Sorry, you touched on one comment that there's an update to the app coming hopefully in the summer, but there's from another side of that question is that Curtis would really like to see the mobile app have all the features of the desktop website. And so could you just talk a little bit more about how the app is updated, just that process?
Yeah, that is all developed by iNaturalist.org, which is how we're able to be involved. They kind of update the app, they maintain the backend, the databases, which is a lot of work. The part of the redesign of the app is, yes, one, incorporating the image recognition software offline, but they are looking to make it a better user-friendly experience. I don't know if they're going to build it kind of as similar to the desktop app, or desktop, the website, just because it does have limitations when you're using an app versus a website. But I know a lot of it is going to be the interface, the ability to kind of scroll through and visualize things a lot better on the app. One other potential that might be coming to the app is, with the image recognition working offline, they may be able to incorporate, when you pan on a species, to say, oh, you're getting a picture of a snake, make sure you get the patterns on the back. Like just a few pointers to the observer as they pan across a species to be able to help identify that. No guarantees it's going to happen. I've been strongly requesting it and pushing for it. They think it's doable, but it's still kind of in the planning or programming phase to see if that's going to work.
Awesome. We've got another question just about an individual observation, and I'm in the middle of typing. If you go onto iNaturalist and make the search, you can actually find that record and maybe click on it yourself. But yeah, James had said that 100% of the rattlesnakes that are identifiable are identified, but that doesn't mean that they can't have someone go over them again, who maybe has more experience with rattlesnakes. You keep adding to that identification and adding comments and that sort of thing. I don't know that there's a limit on that, but
yeah,
that's all I see with that.
Yeah, and it could be just sometimes depending on the person taking the observation, if they uploaded, if they took a photo somewhere and then uploaded afterwards and clicked, get their current location, maybe they saved it after the fact and didn't realize that it's not taking the GPS from where they took the photo from. So that could be some of the outer range species. It definitely happens at times. Or if you could look at the accuracy, maybe the accuracy is like 1,000 kilometers, which is possible, which means that point could be anywhere within 1,000 kilometers of where it was actually taken. A good question I see about private property and endangered species. This is tricky. iNaturalist is a public-facing database. And I've had this.
James, I'm not sure I see that. That may have been individually to you. So can you just repeat the question?
It is. Sorry, yeah, it was just me. So what happens to private property if an endangered species is identified on private property? I've had this discussion with many biologists and folks from the conservation data centers. It's tricky. iNaturalist being a public-facing platform, it is, and the kind of terms of service does get to this somewhat in iNaturalist of like the policy of use, that it is expected of the observer to legally have permission or have the ability to legally post an observation from where they're posting it. So if you're not supposed to be on a private property and you're posting observations, whether it's an endangered species or not, technically you should not be posting it, should not be there if you don't have permission to access the property. But species at risk definitely come with other connotations. Observations, one option is to mask or obscure the observation, which I'll talk about in a bit. We and NatureServe Canada have access to those, and those do get shared with the conservation data centers, so they do eventually get those locations. So it comes down to what gets done with those. Different conservation data centers have different policy on and capacity on how they're incorporating that into their database and how quickly they can do that, just based on capacity. But yeah, I mean, it's if you're on a property and you don't think you should be posting something that might be used, then I would suggest to not, or to obscure it, or make sure you have permission to be able to do that.
And if I can jump in here a little bit, when I was working for Canadian Wildlife Federation with James as the boss's boss, one thing that we were really explicit about when we were asking to look for turtles on people's property was, if we find this observation, can we submit it? And that means that there will be habitat protection that comes into effect. So we explained exactly what the connotations of having these observations be submitted to a conservation data center meant. And we still got people that were super enthusiastic about having us on their property. And so for some properties, you're not going to get that access, you're not going to get that permission, and that's fine. But they like have the conversation before you even start looking for the species.
Definitely good advice. I'm going to move on, just kind of time management on the slides and stuff going on. So I'm going to get into this. It's a good segue actually into how data is shown on iNaturalist and shared, which does perfectly well tie into species at risk and locations on properties. So we call this geoprivacy. There are two different kinds of geoprivacy. There is the taxon geoprivacy, which basically means anything that is automatically obscured in iNaturalist. And then there's the geoprivacy, which is user selected. So every person that takes an observation at the time of observation or after the fact can choose to set the geoprivacy themselves on their individual observation. So the taxon geoprivacy, this automatic one, we have a list of about 200 species that we call sensitive to persecution or harm. 25 of these are herps, which includes Massasauga. And you can see at the bottom here how that's displayed on iNaturalist. So the default to observations is that it's public. You can see the exact location within that accuracy I was talking about. Obscured means they are hidden and they're randomly buffered by a roughly 20 by 20 kilometer square box, and that true point is a random spot within that box. And then there's private, which basically means it does not show up at all on any maps in a search. So if somebody searches for that species, it won't even show up as if it exists there. Most of those 200 species, almost all of those are set to obscured. We have 3 species in Canada we have chosen to make private based on concerns from experts and looking into it, which are the wood turtle, spotted turtle, and American ginseng. So it was believed that large box was still not enough to keep that species safe, so they actually don't show up on the map at all. Sorry. Okay, so I've got a delay in my slides. There we go. So when iNaturalist was launched, all kind of S1 to S3 is called, but kind of rare species in Canada were obscured because basically there wasn't any other system in place, which meant there were like thousands in Canada. And this is those automatic obscuring. We've worked since 2018 with species experts, mostly the conservation data centers, but other experts as well. We consulted the status reports that CSIWIC uses in their assessments, which we've talked about already. This was published on iNaturalist for community feedback to give people time to weigh in on certain species and then give people time to make changes to their own observations. If something was going to go from, say, obscured to then be open and be public, then they could change their own individual observation to keep that obscured. So now, as I said, we've kind of gotten through and teased this list down to about 200 species in Canada, and it is still evolving. I think we've got it pretty well set, but there's an ability for people to request a change to this list. So there's at the end, I've got a link to the page where you can get more information about that and where that request can be made to. So access to some of these observations, these kind of obscured observations, there's kind of these 5 ways that I'm going to go through each one a little bit onto how people can get access to this obscured data. So for one, we are provided a data cut from iNaturalist.org because we are their kind of the affiliated lead here in Canada. So we have all of the observations to which the taxon geoprivacy, that's the automatically obscured ones. So those that are set to obscured or private, we get access to those. But for people who have affiliated with iNaturalist.ca, we also have access to the ones people individually, as I was talking about, can manually set to obscured. We get those directly. We can share those with the Conservation Data Center, and that's kind of explicit in the geoprivacy page that the link will be to at the end of this. We do not access or get the observations that are set to private, just because if someone sets it to private, we don't want to even necessarily know that it's there or be able to share that data. We also then provide it to our steering committee members, which I mentioned at the beginning is Parks Canada and NatureServe Canada. And as I mentioned, that NatureServe Canada, all the provincial conservation data centers are affiliated with NatureServe Canada, so the data does make it to them to incorporate in their databases. GBIF, which was mentioned earlier, the Global Biodiversity Information Framework, they get an automated data cut kind of ongoing from iNaturalist.org of only the research grade observations. But if anybody's working with GBIF data that's from iNaturalist, just be aware that that is for anything that's obscured, that will be the randomized point within that large buffer. It won't actually be the true location. So some people are working with GBIF data thinking they've got that real true location of where a species is located. But if you look at the metadata on that to make sure that it is not an automatically obscured species, otherwise you're working with kind of false pretenses under that. So another way is through projects, which I'll talk a little bit more about projects after as well. But when you set up a project, you can set it up to, so these are projects that any iNaturalist user can set up within iNaturalist to kind of combine observations either by area or by species or by members. So when setting up one of these projects, you can check this little box that says, yes, allow people with to provide access to their hidden coordinates. So from a project creator's side standpoint, if you're wanting to get some of that data directly without having to go through a data request that I'll talk about afterwards, this is a good way to do it. But also from a user perspective, you definitely want to think about who these people are that you're sharing your obscured coordinates with, because this will be for any observation you've made that you've clicked manually to make obscured, but also those automatically obscured ones. Those will still go to that project administrators. So one good way to find that out is within the project about section, you can see who created the project. You can click on their name, which would bring you to their account. So you can read up on themselves, on their description. You can see if they're affiliated with a reputable organization. You can look at who they're following and who is following them potentially, because maybe you don't know this person, but you see, hey, they're following James Pagé. They must be a good person and know, they're going to keep that data safe. So there's a kind of way to kind of read up on those people as well. Which also is another, from this page is another way to also look into getting the access to some of the data, is there's an ability to message people through their account. So if you're looking at an observation that's obscured and you're really like, oh, that seems like a really interesting observation, it's maybe out of range for Massasauga and it looks like it's accurate, you can go through to the observer's profile page and message them and say, like, explain to what you're up to, who you are, and see if they're willing to provide any additional information about their observation. I should mention, which I didn't before when I was talking about the obscuring, the location is obscured for those observations, but the date is also obscured. So people can't go onto the site without doing a lot of kind of legwork to look at, say you saw an obscured species, but like 5 minutes earlier, you saw a really common thing that's not hidden. They can kind of infer that, okay, well, you must have been right there. So now for these species that are obscured, the date basically just provides the month. Similar, any comments or any identifications also just provides the month for when that identification was made. Okay, so back to accessing those coordinates. One other way that people can grant access and get access to these obscured observations is through your own profile page setting. If you go into your account settings, into edit account settings, you can look at relationships. Within there, anybody that you are following, you can choose to trust them with your hidden coordinates. So if I click this box, that means Dave Seaburn would have access to all of my observations that are otherwise obscured, which is okay. I trust Dave. But just to bear in mind, they would get access to every observation you've made that is also obscured. which is a great way of sharing observations, especially if, you know, with colleagues, with coworkers, if you're working on the same project. That means they would get all your data without having to kind of put it through a project to get access to that. And with that, I will take a little pause and see if we have any questions or discussion. These are the herp species that are automatically obscured in iNaturalist. I wasn't going to get into debating which species belong on this list or not, but if there are kind of questions about the data, how they're obscured, and I'll speak a little bit afterwards on how to request access to observations as well. So I'll get into that in a little bit.
All right, so I'm going to encourage people to go into your little reactions button at the bottom of the Zoom screen and raise your hand if you've got a question. I know we touched on one of your questions, Tiana, but did you have anything else you were curious about how to trust coordinates within projects and that sort of thing?
No, he explained it exactly as I was hoping he would.
So we've got a comment in the chat. I'm sorry you're showing up as Hannah McCurdy-Adams. I'm just taking over this workshop as everybody. But if you'd like to raise your hand, you can speak. I'll just read some of it. That the large box may not be useful for things like the Massasauga if there's only a small area of suitable habitat obvious for that area. And I think that's part of the reason that spotted turtle and wood turtle are completely private. They don't know points that you can see on iNaturalist. And so one thing that I do with iNaturalist is look at whether or not there are other points in the area that I'm in. I know I'm getting the obscured dots, but if there's a whole bunch of other points, like there is all up and down Eastern Georgian Bay, then there's already a lot of points there. So for me, that isn't a worry, but maybe if you're at the range edge, go onto the NHIC webpage. They have a spreadsheet to download and you can upload that. It's just when you're talking to community members that may not have the Western science background, may not even know how to use a spreadsheet, but can put an app on their phone, you still get that information to the people that are making decisions about development, for instance, without having to sort of do more training on a computer. But if you get really involved with the community, have more of these in-depth workshops, then you can sort of get into that discussion.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, a way to kind of get at those true locations if you're really needing it is through projects as a potential. I did look through and there aren't any projects that target Massasauga, which isn't necessarily. There's a way to get at the data as well, which I'll talk about in a bit, but you would get those kind of large boxes. The other one is through a data request through us and NatureServe Canada to get the true locations of those observations. So that is something that can be requested and obtained through us. If you need kind of for research purposes and conservation work, that could be provided as well. And I'm not sure for that question if I think it means it's not useful for us to undertake conservation as opposed to not useful for hiding and keeping the species safe. That's kind of my interpretation of that question.
Yeah. Sorry,
yeah.
Unfortunately, that person has not raised their hand, so I'm not sure who they are, but yeah, I think you're right there. I think we covered both sides. Or if you can't figure out where to raise your hand, just unmute yourself and talk. But I don't see that happening, so no worries. They're anonymous.
So yeah, through that, you know, if kind of the way that question is framed does tie into whether, you know, these species are the appropriate ones to have automatically obscured or make private on iNaturalist. There's a geoprivacy page, like I said, that mentions the reason, the rationale, how to access the data, and how to make a request if you don't think, if you would like to suggest or have a rationale for a change, that is open. It is iNaturalist. We're trying to balance the kind of top-down versus bottom-up approach. Originally, it was entirely community curator-led as to which species were hidden and not. I totally understand the value in that. There's also a risk that means anybody with some curator status in iNaturalist can make those changes, and now they still can, but we're requesting that they don't, just so that it's, for one, a list can be easily found, like it's a consistent list, it doesn't change entirely, and when it does, we have the ability to notify the community, but also that, you know, it's vetted by experts and reports like the status report for species, to kind of keep that list a bit tighter, robust, and well vetted. So that's and that our partnership with NatureServe Canada comes into play a lot with that, being the experts on species, rare species occurrences and sensitive species as well.
Yeah, and so I think we've got a comment here about adding the dusky salamander to that list. And so yeah, go through the process James just talked about. And then there was another comment, when you upload an observation that's a species at list, I think the question, Liv, feel free to unmute yourself and just talk, but that the AI that suggests species, does it suggest the species at risk?
It will suggest the species name, but I think is what she's saying is that it won't let you know that it's at risk when you make that observation, and that's correct. It'll give you a species. After the fact, you can see that on your individual observation, like we saw with the plains garter snake. It'll show if it's at risk, vulnerable, or native status. So on the observation itself, it'll give that, and then you can click through to read more about that species and why it might be at risk and some information about it. But at the time of selecting the species, you're right, it does not identify that like flagging to you that, oh, you're making an observation of the species at risk. Tying into that, which would be valuable, which I don't think is going to happen in the app, I think it's just the programming is too complicated for them to make it work, would be when you're selecting a species or clicking on your whether you make it private or not, it would be valuable for people to know which species are already automatically obscured so they don't do it again. So if someone sees a Blanding's turtle, they don't have to click obscured because it is already obscured. The value of that is that, again, it's easier for us to be able to access and share that data for conservation. So especially if a person, and you all can check your account settings, if you're not affiliated with iNaturalist Canada and just iNaturalist.org, we don't have access to your obscured coordinates. We can only get that for people who have affiliated with iNaturalist.ca, which most people are now, and we've kind of hammered that message home a bunch, and there's been some notices on the site and that. So we can access those if you're affiliated with iNaturalist.ca. Conversely, if you don't want us to have it, so if you don't want your data to go to NatureServe Canada and the CDCs, you could choose to affiliate with iNaturalist.org. You could still upload your observations and we wouldn't be able to access those. But again, that data becomes less valuable for conservation use in Canada.
All right, that's all I'm
Okay.
seeing.
Perfect. Yeah, I think it's good timing to move on anyway. So perfect. Okay, so I'm going to get into a little bit of now ways to use iNaturalist, which includes access to the data. So the first and easiest way to access the data is through the Explore page. It's kind of one of the main ones when you go to iNaturalist, and then basically shows the map by default. And if you go to iNaturalist.ca, it shows a map of all the observations in Canada. You can then choose in the search bar to search by species, by a specific location. And if you click on the filters, it gives you all these options. And then actually there's more filter options if you click on the drop-down arrow. So this allows you to search by species category, by date observed, by date added even. If you're interested in using photos, you can search by photo licenses. So you can search for those that only have Creative Commons license, which means you can use them for presentations or for media stuff, and each one, so that it's kind of an extra filter option as well. There also is an option when you go to your species search, when you get your values, you can go to download the data, which allows you to get an Excel sheet of those observations that you set up in your search parameters. Again, this will only give you it'll give you the observations of species that are also obscured, but it'll give you that kind of caveat that that's a random point within our 20 by 20 kilometer buffer. There's also, it looks like things got shifted. Oh no, that's okay. There's also these custom search URLs. So similar to this observations page, if we type into the top bar these types of search URLs, and again, I'll have a link at the end of this as to where to find a whole 2-page wiki post about how to use these and some examples. But basically this here gives our place ID, which is, again, I mentioned this is Canada. Our taxon ID, this is for Massasauga. And that unique code means that is the species Massasauga, that if you can change that around to search for different species. As I mentioned, that observation field I was interested in of on roads, the search term ID is that field, that annotation for all species, or yeah, the species field for all species that have used this custom field. Sorry, no, this is the annotation. Within those parameters, you can select if it's, if it's alive or dead. This one wasn't on roads. So this would search for that field of annotation of alive or dead. That's the search query, and the result, the value ID number is for dead. So I didn't put pictures up for this, but for good reason. But the results come through, as we see underneath, is there was 178 observations of Massasauga in iNaturalist that have used that annotation, that kind of drop down and selecting alive or dead, that are in Canada. So something to look at if you're interested in maybe road mortality. This gives you 180 observations of Massasauga that are dead on roads, most likely on roads, not necessarily, but that's a good way to look through. Also valuable is, all the Massasaugas are identified already as research grade. So an add-on value would be to go through observations and give them an annotation as noting whether it's alive or dead. And then when you search this term, we will get many more observations probably of that species that is not alive. So that's just kind of one example of how we can use custom URLs. And again, we can, within that filters tab, once you get to this place on the website, it kind of lands on that same explore page. You can click on that filters and download this data to get a spreadsheet of that.
James, just a quick question. Are you able to
Yeah.
copy paste that link and put it into the chat? I know
Yeah,
it may not be easy.
It's in my presentation, but I can't select it to put it in the chat while I'm talking. So
Well,
I can
okay,
maybe do
we'll
it.
get it. How about this? We'll get it to people afterwards, and you'll see the slides afterwards.
Yeah.
After this
Yeah,
workshop.
and there's a like I can drop it in probably after as we're chatting at the end.
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought I could select copy from my notes on my presenter view, but you can't select notes either, which is kind of unfortunate. Yeah.
Of course not.
I know. Not making it easy. Anybody can take a screenshot if they want. And so then the other option, as I mentioned before, is a data request. You can send that through to me, but I then likely put it through, if it's in a province, we would put it, you could go straight through to the provincial conservation data center. So Massasauga Range would be the Natural Heritage Information Center in Ontario. If you're requesting data from them generally, and you want the iNaturalist data, make sure you specify that's what you would like as well. I don't know if they provide that every time someone puts in a data request, mostly because they haven't yet vetted all of the iNaturalist data to be incorporated straight into their database. So they can provide it, but they would have to obviously provide it with a caveat that this is raw data, not vetted, but you would still get that. Otherwise, you can, as I said, go through me and I can put that through to NatureServe Canada, which then connects through to the conservation data centers if needed. So another kind of way, a way that some of this end data is being used and can be used. A good example is the key biodiversity areas. There are 78 in Canada right now. There's another 882 candidate sites, and I just kind of stole this map off their website to show everyone of where the current ones exist. They've been using the iNaturalist Canada data to help inform their criteria or inform their locations of key biodiversity areas. And we're working with them, especially through NatureServe Canada, to access and to make use of that data. So as I said, similar to that data request, they've requested that data through NatureServe Canada. They have access to those, all of the data, but also those otherwise obscured observations to help inform that. Now, they cannot reproduce that data. They can't show data points of those species that are obscured in iNaturalist at a scale that iNaturalist would obscure them at. So they can't depict anything at a scale finer than that 22 or 20 by 20 kilometer box. They can show key biodiversity areas that are smaller than that. They just can't specify which point came from iNaturalist in that range. So it's kind of an extra way to safeguard the iNaturalist data. I want to mention this is some of CWF's work. So data points, the location of information is one thing. There's also a lot of information in the photos themselves. So we looked through the photos of northern map turtles throughout the range in iNaturalist and looked for incidences of what looked to be propeller strikes on the plastron of the turtles. So we were able to map these out with the obviously injured turtles along with uninjured turtles. The yellow triangles are injured. Yeah, sorry, carapace. Yes. Did I say plastron? I did, didn't I? Sorry, wrong group to make that mistake with. So yellow triangles show what looks like an incidence on the carapace of boat strike, and along with the blue ones that are other seemingly uninjured turtles. So just to this is about to be published as well, to show kind of that we can use images and community science to look at kind of threats to a species, not just on location information and description that people provide, but also in the photos that they weren't thinking that they were trying to submit photos of injuries to help inform science, but that's an extra use that we can make of this data. So I mentioned projects. Projects can be made for research to access the data, but also a great way to engage community or people in community sciences. It can be as broad as we have of adding all observations of turtles in Canada, like we have with Help the Turtles. The Canadian amphibians and reptiles on roads is specifically looking at species on roads. The formerly known Herp Atlas of Ontario, the Canadian Reptile Amphibian or Ontario Reptile and Amphibian Atlas, has a project to add observations of reptiles and amphibians in Ontario. And then you can even be specific as the kind of this one on the middle right of one specific road looking at observations of species on that road in particular. Also, they can get down specifically. So we have some of these are what are called collection projects. So they automatically add observations that fit a set of parameters. Some others are traditional projects. So they're not quite as flashy, but they have the added benefit of having those fields that I was talking about. You can add those custom fields into those traditional projects if you're looking at needing to acquire more specific data than just a location. So if you're looking at if you're wanting to know condition or distance to a culvert for road surveys, you can have fields that would request people to add in that specific information if you want added information on that. But basically the collection projects are what the majority of people are using just because they're looking to aggregate a bunch of observations within those certain parameters, and you can get at those access to those true coordinates of otherwise obscured observations. You can even do, BioBlitz style observation, like this bottom one was basically, all observations within an area at a given time. But within that, you can still search by observations. So this one was snake days, but it allowed observations of all other species. But if you click on the search, you can search by snakes or specific species, and you can still export observations that way. If you're the manager of that project, when you click export observations, you will get access to those true coordinates that members have allowed. Like that checkbox that I mentioned when creating the projects, people can choose to let you have access to those private coordinates. You won't necessarily get those by default, so people have to allow access to that when they join the project. So it would only be people who have joined, and you can see at the top here, there's a little join button. people would have to join the project and then give you access to their coordinates that way. But then when you export the observations, you do have that. When you do export the observations, you'll definitely want to make sure there's a bunch of columns you can export, including some that are called private latitude and private longitude. Those are the ones you want that'll have the true location of those observations, because if you just do latitude and longitude, it'll give you that obscured data point. So you definitely want those other two columns in there when you download the data. And then lastly, so ways of engaging and sharing on the other side. So as I mentioned, BioBlitzes, it's a great way to engage people in either all species, or it can be a herp specific BioBlitz or a species specific blitz. I guess it's not considered a BioBlitz if it's just one species. It's a snake blitz potentially, but anyway, semantics. The benefit of projects as well is you can put it out journal posts. So anybody who has joined your project will get an automatic email of your post. So there's a section within that project that the managers can write in posts and announcements and that kind of thing. So all the people who have joined your project would get that. So it's a way to share information, share some results, but also engage people to be of upcoming events like a snake blitz, or timing of year when the snakes are kind of emerging from hibernation. You can kind of let people in the project know, like, hey, first snake was seen this year, get ready, field season starting. But also to provide information on on some results and data analysis and that kind of thing. We've done this with our this is a general one we call Observation Nation. We found it been pretty successful in running some contests, some prizes for like achieving milestones. Like once you hit 100 observations, you're eligible or automatically get this kind of some kind of prize to engage and to inspire people to contribute. Something that we haven't done a lot of, but I know of some organizations that have tried ID parties. It can either be virtual or in person, of like kind of people getting together for helping to identify species in a project specifically, or kind of all of iNaturalist, or species specific. So it's kind of a way to again, for one, engage people, but also share that knowledge of, you can get species experts along with beginners, and a big level of encouragement to maybe the non-experts is that you don't need to be an expert. If you can classify something as a snake, it's better than it being left as unknown. And then that way the experts can go through and just filter by snakes, and they know they otherwise they would miss a bunch of observations, because someone who's really looking to help identify a species group probably isn't looking at all of the observations at one given time. So even just that one level of triage is actually quite valuable for improving identifications in iNaturalist. And with that, I'm going to leave it on this last page, which has a bunch of those links I was talking about. Again, if anybody wants to take a screen capture, they can, but we can send these around for sure after the fact. And I can, once I stop sharing, I can copy all of these too and put them in the chat. So one is 2 wiki posts about how to use those custom searches. One is this taxon geoprivate. One is to search for all observations to which, like I said, the taxon geoprivacy applies. So this will give you a list of all the observations that are obscured in iNaturalist. And the geoprivacy page, which I was talking about on how to make that request for changes, but also talks about how we came to those decisions and what it means to be geoprivacy, to be a geoprivate observation. And with that, I think there's a few minutes for continued discussion.
There definitely is. So, and then we've got some chatter about the Ontario Nature Reptile and Amphibian Atlas, which stopped taking observations and switched over to analyzing, but they do have the Herps of Ontario iNaturalist project. And then we've got a question, Shannon, if you'd like to unmute yourself and just say it out loud, you're welcome to.
Okay, yeah, sure, thanks. I'm wondering how to best set up a project within the context of having multiple locations. So we're a nature trust, and we have nature preserves all across Ontario. And so I would like to be able to leverage the community science efforts across all of those projects. And I'm just wondering the hierarchy of like best setting up a project that is inclusive of all of those separate locations. without having to like add each like location as a project itself. Does that make sense?
Yeah, actually, I was going to suggest one of those. There's two options. One is to create each one as a project itself, and then each one is what's called a collection project, and you can make an umbrella project which ties all of them together. That's a bit more work because you're making an individual project. The other way to do it is you can make up one collection project, one individual project, but have multiple locations, places. So you create a place in iNaturalist. It's under Places tab, under the More Places. You have to create a new place, and it'll require you to add a KML file of your, like a shape, which is boundary, a shape file of your location. Your KML file could contain multiple polygons within that. And that's creatable through Google Earth or through QGIS. And so your place could be all of those individual properties. And then that one place, when you create your collection project, you add that place is to automatically add observations from that place and would include all your properties.
Okay, that's
the
amazing.
other
Yeah,
option
because
is
200 sites. We have over 200 sites. So I was wondering if I was going to have to go through and make over 200 projects and then umbrella them,
you
or
could. I mean, some organizations have done that. The KBA, I was just speaking with them. We're looking at doing that, and they're going to have probably 1,000 individual projects under one umbrella. That's doable. And when you create one, you can click to duplicate project, so you won't have to write it up every single time. You'll have to change your place boundary to be each individual property, but there's a way to kind of speed that process up. But it will be a bunch of little projects, so you may be better off doing one project that has all those boundaries in one.
okay, thank you.
I did see a hand at Liv Callow. It disappeared, so maybe your question was answered.
It wasn't a hand, no, it was a clapping, my hands clapping.
Oh, there you go. That was my mistake.
I'm going to stop share, and then I can copy some of these URLs for folks into the chat here as well, for some of those search URLs and that. But I'm still listening if anybody has other questions.
Yeah, we just had one come in. Corey, you're welcome to unmute yourself and just ask, so I don't have to read. Okay, I don't hear or see Corey's jumping in. So if a project is set up for an area, would the users making an observation in that area be told that there is a project for that area and suggest they join?
That is a good question. It doesn't really exist anymore. It would be valuable, I agree. I don't know if it's a programming issue on the back end that doesn't work that way. So no, if a project is set up to automatically add observations from an area, people may not even know about the project. Their observations still go in, which is good because you still get the observations of people who don't know about it. Bad because then people don't know about your project. What you can do, and I've suggested this if you're looking to kind of build your community, what you can do is then you can individually message that person. So you would see all your observations in that project. You would see the observer name. You could click on that to get to that page where I showed you before. You can direct message the person, and you can kind of have like a custom or copy paste message to them to be like, hey, we saw you add an observation. Here's our project. Would you like to join? You can put a link in your message for them to join the project. That's for the automatically added ones. For those traditional projects, people will actually get notified. So traditional projects, the project managers and curators, you can make certain people curators of the project, can add other people's observations physically to the project. When that happens, that person will get a notification to say, hey, your observation was just added to the NHIC, because I know that one's a traditional one, added to the NHIC project for species at risk. So they will get that notification, but that's only for traditional projects, which there are much fewer of.
Yes, absolutely. So we do have one more word cloud for everybody. The link will be added to the chat very soon. And the question that we would like you all to contribute to is, what is your favorite community science project? Or what is a project that you would recommend that others check out after the workshop? And this is very broad, does not have to be Massasauga specific. It can be any project related to any community science work. And as a reminder, the word cloud works best if you put in concise answers with only a few words. So if you do have multiple ideas or projects that you would like to recommend, please do them each in a separate post or addition to the word cloud.
And they are starting to come in. You see my screen with them popping up.
I see your screen. Yes, it looks great.
All right, so, and yeah, we'll share these word clouds afterwards, but we've got Frog Watch popping in. That's a Toronto Zoo program, Aura, the Ontario Nature Reptile and Amphibian Atlas. And so we said that's actually now the Herps of Ontario iNaturalist project. iNaturalist Road Mortality, there's the Canadian Herpetological Society project that's on one of James Pagé's slides. Turtle Tally, another Toronto Zoo. City Nature Challenge, I believe that's through iNaturalist. Well, Adopt a Pond app, lots of the Frog Turtle, Turtle Tally, Adopt a Pond, all of those that Danelle helped manage. Bumblebee Watch, thank you for the recommend. That's Wildlife Preservation Canada is actually involved with that one. Moths of Ontario, I haven't heard that one. Marsh Monitoring Program, Magneto One First Nation, they have phone numbers that people can actually just call. The same with the Saving Turtles at Risk Today project. I don't know that I can add while I'm sharing my screen. I think that's asking too much. Hi, Butterfly. All right, I think we're slowing down and I've lost my facilitator agenda to now. So I'll leave the link open. You can keep adding and we'll share this after the workshop.
Perfect. So yeah, keep your responses coming in. And just a couple of very quick notes before we all go our separate ways. The recording from this workshop will be added to the new SEMReg YouTube channel. So just give a little bit of time for some editing and back-end work on that, and then it'll be up and accessible. The slides for the presentations will go into the workshop materials folder, which I believe everyone has a link for, but another one will likely appear in the chat any moment now. And if you have any feedback, we would love to hear it. This is the first event of this type that we have done, and we are looking to learn to make the future events as helpful and meaningful and informative as this one has been. So there will be a post-meeting survey, and that should pop up for you, or sorry, it should be available to you via a link. So please do take a little bit of time and fill that out, share your thoughts with us. And you will receive a follow-up email as well with ongoing information. So with all of that out there, just a final thank you to the wonderful presenters that we had the pleasure of hearing from today. There's so much that I know I have learned, and I hope that everyone else was able to take something away as well. Thank you to the working group and to the facilitators for all of the time and effort that's gone into this over the past many weeks. And yeah, looking forward to doing it all again and seeing everybody at different points along the way. So thank you everyone for sharing this space and time with us, and enjoy the rest of your day.